Hello everybody! Today we're going to talk about one of the most important and common tactics in chess, and that is the pin. We are first going to go through what a pin actually is, as well as the different kinds of pins, the pieces that can give pins and can't give pins, and finally, how you're going to use them in your games. So let's get started with defining a pin. You are pinning a piece when you attack a piece in such a way that it cannot move without losing a piece of greater value that is stuck behind it. So just think about if you pin something down in real life, you're making sure it can't move and it can't go anywhere. That's what you're doing when you're doing a pin in chess. So there are three types of pieces that can give pins. Pins are going to occur along diagonals like this, or along files or ranks. So bishops, queens, and rooks can give pins, whereas knights, kings, and pawns cannot give pins. Let's look at some examples of different pins. So here in this scenario, this bishop would be said to be pinning this knight to this king. So here, this is called an absolute pin. That is because the king is the piece that is behind the pin piece. And therefore, there is absolutely no way that you can move this knight away because that would put the king in check, and that's an illegal move. On the other hand, you can also have a pin which is called a relative pin. And here, even though it's not illegal to move this knight, you could move this knight, it's not desirable. So it's a different sort of pin where it is possible to move the pin piece, but you just would not like to do it. So let's look at another type of pin here. This is a pin that can be given by a rook. In this scenario, it is black to move and you can play rook to e1, winning the queen. This is because the queen is on the same file here as the king, and therefore the queen cannot move off of this file. It's an absolute pin, meaning that the king is stuck behind the queen here. So the next move, the queen is going to be rook 1, and black will win this game. The final piece that can give a pin is the queen. Here, the queen is pinning the knight to the king, and this again is another example of an absolute pin. And in this scenario, even if it's black to move, they just can't do anything to defend this knight, so you will notice that you have to be very, very careful if you're putting a piece on the same diagonal or the same file as a king, as it can be vulnerable to pins. So those are how some pins can look. Let's check out how they can actually happen in our games. Here we're going to start off with a simple opening. We have e4, e5, and both sides start to develop their pieces. Obviously, not all pins are created equal. Some pins can be much, much stronger than others. For example, here we have a simple absolute pin. The knight is pinned to the king and cannot move because that would put the king in check. However, this pin is not so scary because the knight is actually defended and there is no way for white to immediately start attacking this knight and putting pressure on it in the next couple of moves, but you do always have to be mindful of it. Something that you might consider if you're playing with the black pieces here is doing something called breaking the pin. This involves playing a move like bishop to d7. It essentially wedges a piece in between the pin piece and the king, or whatever piece is behind the pin piece, and breaks this pin. So now this knight can move and you're not vulnerable here anymore. Instead, black could decide to pin the knight here with bishop to g4. And this is another example of a pin, except this time it's a relative pin. This knight can move, but that would end up with this queen on d1 being lost to the bishop. Let's look how quickly you could make a mistake here as black by forgetting about this pin. So we have d4 by white, breaking in the center. Knight to f6, the king castles, and then here black makes a huge blunder with the move a5. And now white has the opportunity to push forward and play d5. And the problem with these absolute pins is just that this knight cannot physically move anywhere, so even if you come back and break the pin now, we're just going to be capturing on the next move. And the reason why a5 is so bad is because if we do something else, then d5, we can meet this with a6 and kicking the bishop away. Now this still doesn't look great for black, but it definitely is better than losing an entire piece. So this is how pins can be very important in your chess games. Let's look at another example. Here we have a Scandinavian defense with a trade, and the knight comes to c3 attacking the queen. It's very common to take the queen back to d6 or d8 or even a5. But Perhaps a beginner that's not super familiar with the opening might think that they're keeping their queen nice and active by putting pressure along this diagonal. So they play queen to c6 here. And you have to be very, very careful if your queen or any piece is landing on the same diagonal as the king. So always be mindful before putting a piece on the same diagonal or same file as the king, because that's where you can get into a lot of trouble. Here, white can immediately win with bishop to b5. The queen is pinned to the king, and whatever happens on the next move, we're just going to be capturing this queen here. We also sometimes might have poisoned material. And this is where something might look like a free piece or some free material, but it's actually not, because your opponent will respond with a strong tactic. Now here, as black, would you capture this knight on e5? Is this a good move? No, it is not a good move, because after you capture here, white has a pin, and they can play rook to e1 here. This pins the queen to the king, and this is an absolute pin, meaning this queen cannot move away, and we will be winning the queen on the next move. So this next example is something that I have experienced many times before. Would you castle queenside as white here? It looks pretty natural, but it does fall to a tactic. Again, we get into trouble with the queen being on the same diagonal as the king, and black can play bishop to h6, winning this queen here, and it's all over for white. I've fallen into this a lot of times, so it's very, very common. Just again, be careful about putting your pieces on the same diagonal as the king. All right, so those are some examples of tactics with pins. Let's look at how we can use pins for a strategical advantage as well. When you're looking at a position on the board and there is a pinned piece, always be thinking about the idea put pressure on the pinned piece. Since the pinned pieces do not want to move at any cost, adding more attackers to the pinned piece makes it harder and harder for your opponent to defend. So here, what would you play as black? A nice move would be knight to d4. This adds pressure to this knight, which is pinned to the queen by this bishop here on g4. And the problem is for white, we can't break the pin easily, as I talked about earlier, putting a piece in between the pin piece and the queen, because this bishop has actually wandered all the way over to b3, so it's no longer able to defend. And now the problem is, even if we aren't losing material as white, there is a lot of pressure on our king side, and it's always very, very dangerous if you have to open up the king by capturing with a pawn, leaving easy lanes for your opponent to attack with. Whatever is played by white here, black is going to capture this knight on f3, and after pawn takes, you'll notice that the king is now open to attack. The knight and the queen can start working together and attacking over here. So even though we haven't won material with a pin as black, we've got a big advantage in terms of an attacking position that we got from the fact that the knight on f3 was pinned to the queen. So there we go, there's a few examples of pins and a basic overview of what pins are. So thank you so much for watching, guys. I will try and make some videos about more tactics in the future. I hope you enjoyed, and feel free to subscribe if you did enjoy it. Thank you.